Hello and welcome back. In the previous videos, we had a look at creating a basic chatbot using LangChain and OpenAI. And we also had a look at some of the other key features in LangChain, like prompt templates, chains, agents, and tools. And we also had a look at streaming the responses by passing in the streaming property, as well as a callback function which will write the response to the terminal as the results are streamed back from OpenAI. And we could see this in action by running the node chat demo file in the terminal, and we can see the response streaming in the terminal. We will move on to some more advanced features in the series, but before we move on, I first want to create a simple user interface for interacting with our model going forward. Personally, I like learning a new technology in a practical and visual way, and adding this user interface will allow us to visualize how a real-world application would integrate with LangChain. So let's have a look at what we'll be building. In this video, we will create a simple layout which allows the user to enter a prompt and then send it to the LangChain model. And we can also use this button to clear the current chat history. So as an example, we can use the same prompt that we used in the node demos. And when we click on send chat, this will call an API endpoint which we will create that will pass this prompt to LangChain, and the API will then return a streamable response which will stream the output to the screen. So we can see that in action by clicking on send chat. And after a second, we can see the result streaming back to our user interface. And this creates a fantastic user experience, as the user does not have to wait for the full response to be generated before seeing anything on the screen. In order to make things as simple as possible for us, we will use a framework called Next.js to create our user interface. Don't worry though, we won't spend too much time learning Next.js and styling in this video. I actually have a dedicated series on this, which I recommend checking out. If you are familiar with other frameworks, or if you simply want to create an Express app, you will still benefit from this video. I personally like working with Next.js and find that it makes it very easy to build full-stack applications. And as a little bonus, for those of you who are familiar with Next.js, I will show you how you can create these API endpoints using both the route handler solution, which was introduced in Next 13, as well as the older API route solution. For both endpoints, we will return a streamable response for getting that streaming effect on the front end. So let's get started. Open up a new folder in your IDE. I'm using VS Code in this video. And then open up your terminal and run npx create-next-app at latest followed by a period. This will start the Next.js project setup. You will then be asked if you want to use TypeScript, and to keep things simple, I'll just say no. Would you like to use ESLint? I'll say no. Would you like to use TailwindCSS? Say yes. Would you like to use the source directory? I'll just say no. Use the app router? We will say yes. Would you like to customize the default import alias? I'll just say no. And this will now install all the dependencies for our Next.js app. We can check that our installation was successful by running npm run dev. And we can then open this URL in our browser. And in the browser, you should see something like this. And if you do, it means your setup was successful. We can now go ahead and remove all of the sample HTML code by opening the app directory, and we can then open up the page.js file. If you're not familiar with Next, all the pages of our website will be created within the app directory, and the page file contains all the content for this page. So I'm going to remove most of this by deleting everything in between the main tags, like so. And I'm also going to remove this image import at the top. And I'm also going to remove the styling within this class name property, so that we're left with a page like this. Once we save this, the web page should update automatically and will now be left with a blank page. I also want to remove some of the default styling that is used, so we can do that by opening the globals.css file and then deleting everything except these first 3 lines. And now I'll save this file. So I'm first going to work on the user interface, and afterwards we'll start working on the API endpoints that our front end needs to call. I want to change the background color of our page. So we can do that by typing in this body tag, and within this tag we can now change the background color by providing a property called background color. And for background color we can now set the color in many different ways. For instance, we could type some hash value or just select the color from that drop-down list. After saving this, we can see the background color changing. But I'm actually going to use a different way of styling our project, which is way simpler than using standard CSS. And you might recall that at the start of the project, while installing Next, we said yes to using TailwindCSS. TailwindCSS is a CSS framework that makes it very easy for styling web applications. And I highly recommend having a look at the Tailwind documentation to see several examples of how Tailwind can be implemented in your project. So instead of using standard CSS like this, we will be using Tailwind classes instead. So I'm going to remove the background color and I'm going to type an @ symbol followed by apply, and now we can start adding our Tailwind utility classes. And for the background color, there is only one class that I'm interested in, and that's called BG Gray 800. And you might notice if I remove the 800 for now, we are getting a list of possible values from this auto-completion list. So in order to get this auto-completion, you need to install an extension on VS Code, and that extension is called Tailwind CSS IntelliSense. So after you've installed that, you should receive these auto-completions showing up. So for the background, I will make it gray 800. We do not need to make any more changes to the global CSS file, so we can close this. Now back in our homepage, we can start creating the structure for our application. And since this is not a CSS or HTML course, we are going to go through this quite quickly. So you are welcome to code along, or you can just download the code from my GitHub repo. I'll leave a link in the description. Right, so for the main attribute, we will add the class flex in order to align the content. Then I will set a max width of 6XL. We can then align the content in the center of the page with MX Auto, and I want the content to be centered in the middle of this page. So we will call items center. Also, we will call justify center as well. And I would like this container to have some padding on the top and bottom. And I'll do that by specifying a padding of 24. Let's also add an h1 tag, and this will contain our title for our page, which I'll call LangChain JS demo, and I'll add a few icons as well by pressing the Windows key and period, and I'll then click on this little bird as well as the chain, and this will represent our LangChain logo. Let's save this. And after saving this, we can see our text showing up on the screen, but the color is quite dark. So we can add styling to our h1 tag by adding the property class name. Let's add a few styles to this, like text gray 200, and I'll make the font extra bold. The text size will be text 6XL, and I want the text centered. And because my screen is zoomed in quite a bit for this recording, I'm just going to zoom out on the browser slightly so everything fits within the view. Then below our title, we want to create a form, and within this form and within our form, we will add an input field which we need to style by providing the class name property. And for the styles, we'll add some padding top and bottom of 2, padding left and right of 4. We will round the corners with a rounded of medium. Let's change the background color of the input field to gray 600. We will make the text white, and we'll set the width of this field to full. And we can now see our input field showing up on the right hand side of our title. But we actually want this input field to show up below our title. So in order to do that, I'm going to wrap our title and the form in a div, like so. We can then add some styling to this containing div to align all these items vertically. So we will use flex to align these items and flex column to align these items vertically. And I also want to create a gap between these elements with a gap of 12. Let's add some more properties to our input field. So for this input field, we also need to add a property called placeholder text. And for this, I'll just enter prompt. In order to access the value of this input field later on in our code, we need to give it a name, and I will call it prompt. And then lastly, this field needs to be mandatory. So I will just call the property required. And we now have this input field. So next, let's also add a button for submitting this prompt. So for the button value, I'll enter send chat. Let's go ahead and style this button by providing a few class names. I'll add padding top and bottom of 2, padding left and right of 4. Let's round the corners with rounded medium, and we'll make the text small. We'll set a background color of background lime 700. We'll make the text white, and let's save this change. And we can now see our button showing up on the screen. Let's also add some styling for hovering over this button. So we can add a new class called hover, and we'll set the opacity of the button to 80%. So if we now hover over the button, we can see the opacity change. The change is instant, and I actually wanted to animate. So I'll just add one more class to this button called transition opacity. And if we now save this, we can see the button gradually changing color as we hover over it. And then lastly, I just want to add a type to this button, and this button will be of type submit. Let's also create a button to clear the chat. So I'll just copy the original button, but I will change the type of this button to type button. We will then change the background color to background red 700, and let's change the text in the button to clear chat. We can now see our two buttons showing up on the form. Let's sort out the spacing by wrapping the buttons in a containing div, and let's give this div a few styles like flex, justify center, and we'll add a gap of 4. And let's also add some padding top and bottom with py4. Great. We now need to hook up these buttons to functions whenever they are clicked. For the first button, it will submit the form, and if we don't enter any prompt, we will get this message because it is a required field. So let's enter any value here and click send chat. You might have noticed that when we clicked on this button, the page actually refreshed, which is not what we want. So let's sort that out. On the form, we can provide a property called onSubmit, and we can now pass in a handler function, and we can now pass in a handler function that will get triggered when this form is submitted. I will call this function handle chat submit. Let's go ahead and create this function. Within this component, and just before the return statement, we can create a new function called handle chat submit, which takes in the event as a parameter. And on event, we can call a function called prevent default. And this will prevent the browser from refreshing when we click on send chat. So let's save this. And after saving this, you should get an error message like this. And this is normal for Next 13. And without going into too much detail, Next 13 renders all of these components on the server by default. But when we introduce user interactivity like a form, it won't be able to handle that on the server. So instead, we need to add the following at the top of this file, and within quotes, we need to specify use client. And this will tell Next not to render this component on the server, but this page will be rendered in the browser instead. We can now get the contents of our form by creating a new variable, and I'll call it form data. Form data is equal to new form data. This is a built-in JavaScript class, and form data will take in the event dot current target. And this will now give us access to the input field in our form. We can test that out by writing this to the console, and on form data there's a function called get, and within get we can specify the name of the field that we're trying to access, and we called our input field prompt. Let's go ahead and save this, and then let's open up the console in the browser to see if we get that value. So in the prompt, I'll just type test, and then let's click on send chat. And we can see in the console, we are getting the value from our input field. Great. That is enough for this function for now. We will get back to it once we've created our API endpoints. Let's also create a handler function for the clear chat button. We will call this function handle clear chat, which takes in no parameters. So before we continue with this function, let me first explain what our application is going to do. When we click on send chat, we will invoke our handle chat submit function, and this is going to call an API endpoint which we are going to create, and it's that endpoint that's going to call all the LangChain logic. The response from that endpoint will be a stream. As you remember, when we looked at the demo, we could see the response writing out to the screen as it's being generated. So LangChain will pass us the response in chunks, and we will then write out the response as and when each of these chunks are received. So we need to store that response in some state. So let's go ahead and create that state variable. In order to use state, we need to import useState from React. And then let's create our state variable above our handler functions by calling const square brackets. In these square brackets, we need to give our variable a name like streamed data. And for the second parameter, we need to provide the name of the setter function for changing the value of the streamed data state variable. We will simply call this function set streamed data, and this will be equal to useState, and within useState we need to provide the default value of the state variable, which is a blank string by default. So basically, after we call our endpoint, we will write those chunks as they are being received to the streamed data state variable, and we can set the value of this variable using the setter function. When we click on clear chat, it will invoke this function, and all this function is going to do is it's going to call set streamed data, and it will set the value back to space. And that's it for the handle clear chat function. We just need to hook that up to this button. So on our button, we will specify a property called onClick, and we will pass our handler function to this event. So we can't see it yet, but when we click on clear chat, it will clear the value in our streamed data state variable. So lastly, if we do have values in our streamed data variable, in fact, for testing sake, let's add some value in here. I'll just call it test123. And if we do have a value in that variable, we want to write it to the screen, and we want to output it just below the form tag. So below form, I will first provide a JavaScript condition because we only want to render the response if the variable has some data in it. So we can do that by saying streamed data, which is basically the same as saying not null. So if streamed data is valid or contains values, we want to output the following. And what we want to output is a containing div for our output. I'll also add an h3 heading with the text AI assistant. Let's give this heading a few styles like text 2XL and text gray 400. Then below the heading, we will output a paragraph. And within this paragraph, we will simply output our streamed data. Let's give our paragraph content a few styles like text gray 200, rounded medium, and background gray 700, and some padding all around. And now we can see the output of this variable. If we go ahead and clear the string, so let's set it back to blank, that entire section is hidden. And that is because of this condition over here. Right, I think that's everything in terms of the front end. So let's go ahead and create our API endpoints. Within Next.js, there's two ways to create API endpoints. There are the traditional API routes. Then there is also a newer solution called route handlers. So what I want to do is show you both ways of implementing these APIs, because there is a benefit to learning both ways. And I think the best place to start is to look at the traditional way of creating APIs. So what we can do is in the root of our project, create a new folder called Pages. Then within Pages, create a new folder called API, and within API, we can create our API route, which I'll call chat. And within chat, we need to create an index.js file. And in order to expose this as an API endpoint, we can export a default async function called handler. This function takes in two parameters called request and response. So the first thing I want to do is to extract the prompt value from the request body. We can do this by typing const, then square brackets, and this is equal to request.body. We can now copy this solution that we built in the previous video. So we can copy these two imports and then add those at the top of our API endpoint. We don't have to copy the .env code, as Next.js offers built-in environment variable support. So what we need to do is copy all of this code, like so, and then paste that into our method call. So it should look something like this. Now we can replace this string with the prompt that we extracted from the body. So this way it's using the value from this input field instead of some hard-coded value. So let's also set up the environment variables by going to the .env file in our previous example. And let's go ahead and copy this OpenAI API key. And then in our Next.js project, at the root of the project, create a new file called .env.local. And then paste in your OpenAI API key into this file and then save. In order for Next.js to pick up these changes, we need to stop the server by pressing Ctrl+C, then Y, and enter, and let's simply run our dev server again. This time it should have a view of this environment variable value. So now we need to make a few small changes to this code. If we had to run this API endpoint, the response will simply be written to the terminal as we saw it in the previous video. But what we want instead is for these tokens or these chunks of text to be streamed in the response of this service. To do this is quite easy. All we have to do is replace this code here with the response object, which we got from the input of this handler function. On response, we can call a method called write, and we can then pass in the token as input. So as LangChain generates these responses, it will write each token to the response of the service. Then, after all of this processing has taken place, we want to call another method on the response object called response.end. And this will close out the stream. And that's really it. Let's go back to our page file and let's implement this logic. Let's go ahead and remove this console log and let's call our API endpoint. I will create a new variable called response, and this is equal to await fetch. And we want to fetch that endpoint that is located at API/chat. We do not have to specify pages, and you do not have to include index either. Next.js will automatically scan the pages directory for this endpoint. And in order to call await, we need to convert this function to an asynchronous function. And for the fetch API, we also need to provide an object where we set the method to post. Within the body, we will call JSON.stringify, and this object will take in the prompt property, and to get the value of prompt, we will call formData.get, and within get, we need to specify the name of the input field, which was prompt. Then lastly, we also have to specify a headers property, and for headers, we will pass in a property called content type with the value of application/JSON. So this code will now call this API endpoint, passing in the prompt value in the body. This will now call our model, and it will write the chunks of text or tokens to the response as we receive it from OpenAI. Because we are receiving a streamable object and not a simple JSON object, we need a way of reading the contents of the response. So we can create a new reader by calling response body, and on the body we will get a function called getReader, and this will now allow us to read the stream that is returned by our API. So OpenAI will return the response in chunks, and for as long as we are receiving a response from LangChain or OpenAI, we want to set the value of our stream data. So we can do this by creating a while statement with the value of true. So this will loop until we exit out of it programmatically. We can then get the value from the stream by destructuring done and value from reader.read. Oh, apologies, I need to move this code up into our handle function. So within this while loop, we'll keep getting values coming back from the body, and once done is set to true, we want to exit out of this loop. So we can write this condition that says if done is true, then break out of this loop. Else, we want to decode the value that we got back from the stream by calling new text decoder dot decode and value. And we are doing this because the value that we get back from the stream is not in a text format or a format that we can use. And the decoder will convert this into a string value. We can now call our setter function setStreamedData to now include this text value. So we will take the current state values and then simply append this text value to the end of it. SetStreamedData will give us the previous data as a parameter, and what we need to return is the previous data plus this text value. So this will keep appending the text value to the end of the previous data value. Let's go ahead and test this out. So in the prompt, I will just say hello, and let's click on send chat. So after running this, I am getting an error message, and that is because we haven't installed the LangChain package yet. So back in our terminal, let's stop our dev server, and then let's install the LangChain package by calling npm install LangChain. And let's give that a few seconds to install. After installing LangChain, let's go ahead and run the dev server again. And I'm going to refresh the app. And let's try to run this again. And after a second or two, we can see the response streaming back to our front end. And we can click this clear chat button to clear this chat is done. So let's now have a look at how we can convert this code that uses the older API route solution in Next to the newer route handler solution offered by Next 13. For route handlers, we will not be using the pages directory, but instead we will create a new folder in the app directory called API. Within API, we can create a new folder, and this folder name should not conflict with another folder name in the pages directory. So I'm just going to call this endpoint LangChain. Then within the LangChain folder, we need to create a file called route.js. And we can create an endpoint in the route file by calling export async function, and we can then specify the name of the method that we want to implement. And this is a post method. This function will receive the request as a parameter, and then in the code, we can destructure the value of our prompt by calling await request.json. And lastly, we can return a response from this endpoint by calling return new response, and we can then pass a value to the response like hello. Implementing the logic for the route handler is very different to the logic in the traditional API route file, and that is because of how this response object behaves. If we flip back to this API solution for a second, we can see that we are getting this response object from the parameter list in this function. And this response object makes it very easy to stream data to it with this write method. Unfortunately, with route handlers, it's not that simple. We basically first need to create a streamable object, and then we will write our chunks to that streamable object. And it is that streamable object that we will pass back in this response. This will all make sense in a second, I promise. To keep this code nice and lean, because we will be writing quite a fair amount of code, I'm going to create a new helper function, and I'll call this function run LLMChain. This function will take our prompt as input, and it is this function that will call our LangChain logic. This function, therefore, also needs to be asynchronous. We can then copy the imports from this other API endpoint, and we'll just paste it at the top of this file. And I'll also copy the logic for calling the model, like so. So let's start work on this function. In the route handler solution, we do not have access to this res object. So we need to create something similar by creating a new variable called stream, and this is equal to a new transform stream. And in order to pass values to the stream, we will create another object called writer, which is equal to stream.writable.getWriter. So now we have a streamable object that we can return in this function, and we have a writer object that we can use to write these chunks to the stream. We also do not have to await this response. We can just let this call run in the background, and as it runs, it's going to invoke this function, passing in a chunk of text, also called a token, and we need to write this token to our stream. So to use our stream, we first want to make sure that our writer is available, and this object returns a promise which we need to await. So therefore, we need to set this handle LLM new token function to an async function. Once the writer is ready, we can then write the token to the stream by calling writer.write, and we would be tempted to simply pass the token to the stream, but this will not work as the readable stream expects us to pass the data to it in a specific format which cannot be string values. So we need to encode that data somehow, and it's quite easy to do. We just have to instantiate a new variable called encoder, which calls a built-in class in JavaScript called text encoder. So now we can use this encoder object to convert our string or token to a format that the stream understands. So we will call encoder dot encode, and to be sure that we are passing a string to this, I will pass in the token as a string literal. Then we also want to implement a handler function that runs when the stream is complete. And we will use this to close the stream on our end. And we will use this to close the stream once everything's done. This is called handle LLM end. We will wait until the writer is ready, and then we will call writer.close. So this will now write our tokens to our stream, and it is this stream that we need to return at the end of this function. And more specifically, on the stream object, there's a property called readable, which will return the readable stream. So I believe we are now done with this helper function, and we can now call this function in our post method. I will now create a new variable called stream, which is equal to run LangChain, and we will pass it the prompt value. And in the response, we will now pass back stream, but because stream returns a promise, we need to await the call to stream, like so. Now, in our front end, let's change the endpoint from API/chat to API/LangChain instead. So this will now invoke our route handler endpoint instead. So let's test that out. In the prompt, I'll enter something like, write a poem about the universe. Let's send this. And as you can see, the response is now streaming to our front end. Personally, I don't think there's an issue with either approach. The implementation using the older public API routes is very simple compared to the route handler solution, where we need to create a streamable object and return that back as the response. But of course, the route handler solution is the newer solution introduced in Next.js, but it is really up to you to decide which approach you want to follow. If you decide to use a different framework to Next, and maybe you decided to create a simple Express app, the logic in the Express app will look very similar to this, as Express also gives you access to the response object. So now we have a very user-friendly way of interacting with our LangChain applications going forward. Please consider subscribing to my channel, where I cover all sorts of topics on artificial intelligence and creating full-stack applications. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.